All right, everyone. It's from the whiteboarding lesson earlier. Let's do a new one. Let's do a new one. Let's do a new one. There we go. So by the end of this lesson, I hope that you will be able to use classes in JavaScript. So first, before we get started, JavaScript is not an OOP language. Classes were added super recently, and they're really just kind of formalizing a pattern that people were doing to simulate classes in JavaScript, but they're not real classes. And so, for example, we couldn't do the mod 1 code challenge with like doing the manual many-to-many relationships. We couldn't do that with JavaScript classes. There's not a good way to do the equivalent of like the add at all. And so if you notice some like inconsistencies between how classes work in JavaScript and how classes work in Ruby, it's because the classes in JavaScript are what we call syntactic sugar. It's not a real thing. It's more like metaprogramming, but it allows us to think in a very similar way to how we think in OOP, and it will be really important for React also, because a lot of this class kind of stuff does come up in React a fair amount. I'll also say I don't fucking like these things, and I really wish they hadn't added them to JavaScript. That's no excuse to not learn them, because oh boy howdy are you going to see these things out in the wild. But I think that this was largely a mistake by TC39. Cool. So I'm going to start by just showing you what this syntax looks like, and then I want you to ask me some questions. All right, so I'm going to make some JavaScript file. All right, empty JavaScript file, nothing up this sleeve, nothing up this sleeve. So syntax kind of looks like this. Let's say I wanted to make a dog class. So I might say something like class dog. Let's say I want to give it, let's say I want to have an initializer so that I can like pass in properties that get created. I want to make a new dog. So in Ruby, that was like def initialize in JavaScript, and in every other language, that's called a constructor. And so it might take in like a name and an age. And in Ruby, we would go do like @name equals name. Yeah, kind of similar in JavaScript. We'll say this.name equals name. And we can say this.age equals age. Now, we don't need to make readers and writers for this, because since these aren't real classes, we can just read and write everything willy-nilly. So if I wanted to make Bixby is a new dog rather than dog.new, I'd say Bixby, and oh, he'd probably be about 25 or so at this point. I can just say Bixby.name. I can do Bixby.name equals. I can do all that stuff without needing to make setters and getters. I might make a method called bark. And bark logs something like that. So then I can say something like Bixby.bark. And if I run this, woof, my name is Bixby. Ta-da! So at a very high level, this is kind of what we're looking at with class syntax in JavaScript. I'm going to pause there. Why don't you ask me some questions about this?
Why don't we have to declare our methods the way we do with functions?
What do you mean?
So when we're writing a function, we have to write function, hello world, whatever. Why don't we have to do that here inside the class?
So this is called method shorthand. I'm going to give you some other ways this could be written. You could also write it like this. All three of those are the same thing.
Does any have a specific advantage over the other?
Yes, the fat arrow one is probably the best out of all these. And in React, it's probably the one you'll do the most. And the reason has to do with, since these aren't real classes, this doesn't work as consistently as self did. If you remember back to self in Ruby, self can only be two different things. It can either be the instance or it can be the class. And the difference is real easy to tell. Is it inside of an instance method? All right, well, then it's the instance. Is it outside an instance method? It's the class. That's it. There are, I think, 8 different things that this could be in JavaScript, and including it could be the context of the method that called me. So where this starts falling apart is if I have a method that calls a method that calls a method that calls a method. At some point, this context is going to get lost, and it's no longer referring to the instance. Oops. Fat arrows get around that. Fat arrows say, all right, whatever this is in here is going to be whatever this is out here. That's the only true difference between a fat arrow function and a declared function.
So it's changing the scope of this?
Correct.
And it does that because it's not being hoisted?
No, the hoisting doesn't have anything to do with it. It just has to do with, in regular old JavaScript, one of the most common uses of this is it's the context of the thing that called me. And so if we have functions calling functions calling functions, that actually lets us do some kind of neat things. But that's not how any object-oriented language works. And every other object-oriented language, it's the instance or it's the class. There are no standalone functions that can have their own context. That doesn't make any sense. So when we're trying to emulate OOP in JavaScript, that's the sacrifice we have to make, is that our this gets all loosey-goosey. The fat arrows make them work exactly the way you'd think.
These different ways of writing these functions, are these specifically method functions? You wouldn't write a function like this outside of a method, or you would potentially?
Totally could. If I was going to make a standalone bark method, like that.
And would the same principles apply? The value of writing it like this would be in regards to this?
Yes, and it's also more concise. So, like if I have some element, add event listener. So I have a few different ways I can write this. I could say something like event, fat arrow, whatever the fuck. I can do function. I can do it like that. I could do it like, come on. I could do it like that. So I got some choices there. I certainly like this first-class function way of doing it a lot, but between these two, this one's a little bit easier to read, honestly. And one of the other cool benefits of fat arrows is, imagine I'm doing like a map or something, like it's a double. So I go 1, 2, 3 dot map. You get implicit returns if it's all in the same line. Oh, baby, that's nice. That's a lot better than what that would be in the longhand one, which is these two are identical. That one reads a little bit faster. And to flash forward to next week a little bit, one of the coolest things about fat arrows, and you will have, there's one thing you have to do in Mod 4 that uses this. Otherwise, you can just call it a cool theoretical whatever for right now. Is when you have functions that return functions that return functions, writing those longhand is gnarly. Be something like outer so we could have something like that. And with those arrow functions, I can rewrite that as return, let's see, const outer equals A, B, C, holy shit. And if any of you like studied calculus, that starts looking an awful lot more like the mathematical notation, unsurprisingly. But that and this are the exact same thing. No this involved, but it is a way more concise way to express an awful lot of things. Okay, back to OOP land. Out of all these different ways we can write this, the fat arrow one probably gets you in the least trouble overall. Other questions about JS OOP?
This might sound a bit dumb, but like I've seen the parentheses, you know, many times. But what's the point of it? Just having the parentheses by itself?
We have to have it if we have no arguments. So here's some fat arrow rules. If I have no arguments, it works like that. Let's see. Let's do it that way for right now. If I have one argument, I can do it that way, or I can do it that way. If I have more than one argument, I have to do it that way. So a better way to think of it is that if we're making an arrow function, we always have to have the parentheses unless we have one, and then it's optional. The reason it gets special treatment like that is this idea of an arrow function is taken from functional programming. And in functional programming, you're ultimately trying to reduce every function down to having one argument. But Yeah, if I don't have any arguments, I can't do that. That's not valid syntax. JavaScript doesn't know how to handle that. So I have to indicate that I am explicitly not passing anything in.
How would you call this bark function, the one that's outside the class?
Like that. This is the idea of first-class functions. I can save a function in a variable. Why not? I can save Booleans in variables. I can save strings in variables. I can also save functions in variables. And then I work with them just like I would any other function. That's what a first-class function is.
I'm sorry, but I'm still a little unclear on that. It just means it can be saved in a variable?
Yep. It means the language can save functions and variables.
Okay.
Think of it this way. We can't do that in Ruby. You can't just
No.
take a method and save it in a variable somewhere.
I tried a few times. Didn't work so well.
Yeah, methods are owned by classes. Period. There's like, even when you're like, we were doing like Haskell and stuff, when we're just writing these standalone methods, that's implicitly in a method in a class called main. You just can't see it.
We see like two different classes kind of work together.
Sure.
Possible.
Yep, someone didn't like. Dog.
Can you say it was different than
Oh,
like .new?
yep. Womp womp womp. This is what I get for teaching mod 1 and 3 and 5 at the same time. There you go. If I add some other dogs in there. Can add each of these dogs. Make them each bark. There you go.
So just to clarify, a functional programming language then means it's based on functions as opposed to the object-oriented, which means it's based on classes?
Correct.
Okay.
So you said that even though JavaScript is not an OOP language, we're sure as shit going to see this in the real world.
Yes.
Is there like an example you can give us of where people are actually using this and whether they should or shouldn't be using this?
Ooh, good one.
So the place you're going to see it the most in like the immediate future is in React. So if you take a look at some React code. Here you go. So this is like as normal a React component as there could possibly be. State ends up being a big part of React apps, and with an asterisk. If you are using state in React, you have to use classes. So this is a class called app. Extends is the equivalent, is how would you do inheritance. So it extends another class called component. It has this property called state. It has this method called list items. It has this other method called component did mount. And it has this method called render. We're going to see that a lot in Mod 4.
What is this actually doing on an application?
What this is saying is React uses this thing called JSX. It looks like HTML, but it's valid JavaScript. And so what is expected to be returned from this render method is this HTML looking thing that also has access to your class. So it's going to call that method, which is going to iterate over the things that you have in state and turn each of those into like HTML looking things. And then this one here, whenever someone tries to load this component, it does a fetch and takes the response and sets this property. That is by the numbers React. So that's a place you might see it. Another place you might see classes is client-side ORMs. They're not nearly as popular as they should be. But imagine active record for your client. Like, all right, well, I have this dog model. Can you dog.all, please? And it makes the correct fetch request and like ends up giving you all the shit back. How cool would that be? So what one of those might look like. So I go to Develop Denver. So I made this class. It's just called model. So anything that extends this should get all of these methods. And back in like the pre-arrow function land, we had to like manually bind all this shit. So stupid. Static, that's a class method. So instead of def self.fetchAll, use static.fetchAll. And that's also, much like constructor and initialize, static is what it's called in every other OOP language. Not a class method, it's called static method. And so if you're trying to fetch something that extends this model, you should try to build a URL out of the model name and then try to fetch it and then serialize the data that you get back. Same thing with creating something, updating something. And so then an actual instance of that, like a user profile. User profile extends model. It also has some of its own methods. It overrides the create method because the create is a little bit different for users, but everything else is the same. If I want to get every profile, I just do profile.fetchAll. That's another place you might use something like this.
So in terms of syntax, at the bottom, looks like after your class, you have to tell it to export that class. And if you do that, you can import that in other files with that top line.
Yes, that doesn't have anything to do with classes. That's JavaScript's module system, which you guys haven't worked with yet, but you will plenty in Mod 4. But it's basically, we have two ways that we could have multiple JavaScript files talk to each other. We could just have a bunch of script includes on our HTML file, and then everything can see the thing that came before it. Yeesh. Or we can use this module system. And these are new-ish in JavaScript. They were really inspired by Node, which has always had them. And yeah, that's the other way that we can have multiple files. But yeah, your understanding of it is right. It's pretty intuitive. We can export something, and then we can import the thing that was exported into another file.
And we have to export it to be able to import it, right?
Was
And
it?
we have to export it to be able to import it
Yeah.
elsewhere.
Exactly. Which also means you can have things that are in this file that aren't exported, that are just local to this file. And so you get like private methods and stuff that way.
So that's the equivalent of using private in Ruby.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
So why would somebody, and obviously it's built into React, so it makes sense somehow, but like, why would you be using this on the front end instead of using Node to accomplish your classes and keep track of things? Does that make sense?
Because you have to. Like if the code is running in a browser, the browser can't run Node code. Browser only runs browser code. And
Right.
so I need to do something like go, hey, give me all the users. Well, I can write out that fetch request by hand, or I can put that in a class that other classes can inherit.
Okay. So it's quicker than having to talk to your backend. It's probably shorter to write.
Well, it's more reusable code.
Okay.
Because the way that most people write their front-end apps is they write a separate fucking fetch request for every little thing that they want to do. But semantically, it's still some model asking for its server representation. I'm saying, hey, I have all these, can you give me all the dogs? Well, those are stored in the database, so it needs to ask the server to get all the dogs, and then you get your dogs back, and you might need to reformat them for your front end or whatever else. Okay, good enough. Except it's not night and day different to also get all the users, or to get all the posts, or to get all the comments. And so since those are all functionally the same thing, should we only write that code once and then reuse it everywhere that we need to? That's the advantage of having that in a class on the front end.
Gotcha.
Damn, the develop Denver site looks fucking slick, dude.
Doesn't it?
This is real good. Can't believe I like this much yellow.
Right. Other questions?
So really relationships are very much manually wired up in this way.
Correct.
Yeah, there's no like helpers. Yeah, okay.
And as soon as you get into like relationships, you're probably pushing JS classes beyond what they can really handle. They're okay for like that use case that I had for Develop Denver, whereas like I want a client-side ORM. It's a pretty good use case for classes. Really anything more than that, I think, is more than they can handle. I have seen people, mostly in Node, try to think about Rails. There's like a base class for controllers, and then your concrete controllers inherit from those, and so they get all those methods that have default implementations, and then you pull in instances of models, and then you have like a view class, and every template you make inherits from that. And really trying to recreate like a Railsy OOP style thing in JavaScript, it's a fucking mess. Like I cannot in good conscience recommend it.
So that
So-
would be, if that was something I was considering, that's something where it'd be like, hey, use something else to do it. Like,
Correct.
okay.
And nice. I would, I'll also tell you that the person who wrote the OOP curriculum in Learn loves classes and hates JavaScript. It's like, that is the only way you can like wrangle this unruly language into submission, or you could just learn it. Other questions?
So if you say like, one thing that we need to know from this lesson, what would it be?
Cool. So the things that you need to take out of this are this class syntax, this method syntax, constructors, and this. And I guess this new keyword. You can do all of those things. I'd say you're in like okay shape. One more thing I want to call your attention to. So these parentheses here, it kind of looks like a function body. It kind of looks like an object is opening up, but it's neither of those things. There's no semicolon there. It's not a statement. I also can't just make random statements like const whatever equals hi. Not allowed. It's also not an object, so I don't separate these with commas or anything. It's its own syntax.
I'm sorry, would you mind repeating those things that we need to take away from this again?
Yep. And you're about to practice them too. So you need to know constructors. This is the thing that happens when you call new. You need to know that this is how we save things to an instance or access anything on the instance. You need to know how to make a method on a class. I'd recommend being familiar with both syntaxes too. That's pretty much it. Cool. So there is an assessment for this. I know because I wrote it. Encapsulate state and behavior. What the? Where did it go? Oh, I swear I wrote one for this. All right. All right, I'm gonna give you one right now. Let's do. Let's see, can we do the buildings one maybe? Cool. You can't do either of these, but you can do all the other ones. You also can't make something only readable or only writable or anything like that. So I want you to take a couple minutes and see if you can do this as a JavaScript class. Go. All right, if you would be so kind as to slack me what you got. I'd love to take a look at it.
So it doesn't keep track of all instances in any way.
No.
Could you manually make it so, or it's like a whole thing?
Yeah, you can. I'll show you how. Good job, Ben. Good job, Gordo.
Really, mine works?
Well, using some Go syntax in your return, but otherwise, pretty good.
What was that word?
Go. It's a program. You're doing multiple returns on one of them, which.
Yeah, I thought that might be funky.
Okay, not bad. So let's see how I'd approach this. Build a class for a building. Done. Initializes structor with a name, an address, number of floors, and number of tenants. So I can do something like this dot name equals name, address, number of floors, number of tenants. Since you guys are growing up and growing up and growing up, I'll also tell you that this in particular, not a super great way to do this. And the reason is using these positional arguments is position dependent. So if I swap number of floors and number of tenants, I might not even know. They're both numbers. The math will still work. It'll just be wrong. Uh-oh. So better way to do that with changing very little syntax is to pass them in as an object and destructure them on the way in. Works exactly the same. But now when I instantiate this, instead of saying building one is new building, and then saying something like the Flatiron building, address, New York Avenue, and it's got 15 floors and 400 tenants. So I could do something like that, or I can pass those in as an object and actually label these things. That is a much better design, because now if I call this like that, it still works exactly the same. Order doesn't matter in an object. Much more bulletproof code.
I was about to ask about this. What did we call this in Ruby? Like it had a name, or we passed.
Positional arguments versus named arguments.
Okay.
Cool. So I have initialized it with those things. Readable and writable. Everything's readable and writable in JavaScript. Building should have a placard method that returns the name and address of the building. So we can say placard, and it returns something like this dot name and this dot address. Tell the average number of tenants in a building. And tenants per floor. So I could do something like return number of tenants, this dot number of tenants, divided by this dot number of floors. All right. And yeah, there you go. So if I wanted to do something like that, I keep track of all the buildings that are created. Then what you would do is you have to do something like building. So that's the class itself. And you could say something like buildings equals building 1, building 2. That'll work. You could also make a method for that. We could say something like static average tenants per building that does something like this dot buildings, let's see, do it this way, total population, I'll call it, this dot buildings dot reduce, and we could say sum and building. It's an arrow method, and I'm doing more than one argument. It needs to be wrapped in those. I need to give it an initial value, and then I could do something like return building dot number of tenants. So that sums up everyone, and then I can return population divided by this dot buildings dot length. But like, you have to do this stuff outside of the class, which is the kind of awkward part. But I think that works. Let's see. Building dot average tenants per building. There you go.
So we can just make up an attribute for the class outside of the class like that?
Yep. Because classes are made up. They're not real. It's just an object. And so, yeah, you can assign properties and stuff to them also. Actually, you guys want to see something really fucked up? This is how this is working under the hood, actually. It's kind of cool. Let's say I make some function So functions are also objects in JavaScript. So you can do stuff like some function dot some property. And now you can either do console log some function invoke it, or you can just get some value off of it like that. Weird. Yeah, you can just tack arbitrary properties onto stuff.
So if we declared that building.buildings property outside of the class,
Yep.
could we add in the constructor to push this onto that array? Or
In the constructor, no, because you can't like,
it can't see outside it?
right, this in the constructor is the instance.
Right. So if you put capital building.buildings push this.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I don't think so. Like Damon was trying to do this a couple months ago. They do building.buildings dot push this. All right, let's see if that works. Daggyo, still worked. So like, I've never seen somebody write something like that before. If you're at that point with classes in JavaScript, you probably went down the wrong road and shouldn't be using classes.
Okay.
And you still had to like initialize it outside of it. I don't know, maybe let me do a static property. Let's see. Static buildings. Let's see. Dag, still worked. So there you go. You can do it that way if you wanted to.
So what was static again?
Static is the same thing as class properties or class methods. Every other OOP language calls those static methods or static properties. Means the same thing though. Other questions? All right, have a good lunch, everybody.